Great, well, good morning and welcome to this briefing session. I'm Ngaire Woods and I'm Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. It's a great pleasure to be moderating this briefing here this morning. A very special moment, the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we have some wonderful speakers here to brief you. I would like to start by inviting the State Secretary for Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, Livia Leu, to give us some welcome remarks. State Secretary.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to this important panel. Unfortunately, the 75th anniversary of stock taking gives a bit reason to concern also. It's not just positive. We see the number of democracies is declining, and so is the quality of democracies, according to the Global State of Democracy Report 2022 of International IDEA. And when we look closer, most of the democracy indicators measure, in fact, respect for human rights. So human rights are challenged, are under pressure, and I think this 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a good opportunity to remember the relevance and boost the implementation of human rights. In the Swiss Constitution, human rights are very important and the cornerstone both for our national and for our international policy. Priorities are defined: freedom of expression, abolition of the death penalty, elimination of torture, gender equality, and the protection of minorities. Human rights are, in fact, the condition for sustainable peace and security. So at this year's WEF, with the topic cooperation in a fragmented world, we have to ask ourselves, do human rights still have a global value? And of course, we believe they have. It is, in fact, important to maintain the universal character of human rights. From our side, we do this both in a multilateral as well as in a bilateral way. Multilateral, of course, the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva is a very important instrument, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, but also the General Assembly, the ECOSOC, and the sub-bodies of the ECOSOC, but last but not least, the UN Security Council, of which we are now an elected members this year and next year, and will try to contribute as much as we can also to human rights. In Europe, we also have two important multilateral bodies, the Council of Europe and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, both under pressure from the war against Ukraine. On a bilateral level, we have human rights dialogues with countries around the world. We have our campaign, for example, on the abolition of the death penalty, which we promote all around the globe. We believe in critical, honest dialogue and try to do that both at the multilateral and the bilateral level. In our bilateral cooperation also, we have mainstreamed human rights into all of our programs, and we combine that with measures to improve transparency and democratic processes. A last point, we are now going for our 4th Universal Periodic Review for human rights at the Human Rights Council next week. We believe this is a very important instrument amongst peers, a good opportunity to present also in a self-critical way the situation in each country and exchange among countries. What can we do better? So I think taking stock after 75 years is really, it's an important moment to try and give a new boost to human rights, and Switzerland is certainly part of this.
Thank you very much, State Secretary, and thank you for being part of hosting us here in Davos. We have three panelists, in addition to the Secretary, who are going to brief us this morning. I'm going to start with Volker Türk, who is the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, to bring us right up to the present and his recent comments on the sharp decline in children's rights is the place I'd like to start. I'm then going to move to the man sitting on my left who needs little introduction, President José Manuel Ramos Horta, who Nobel Prize winner and president of his country Timor-Leste, for whose independence and the human rights of the people of Timor-Leste he has spent his life fighting and working, for a view of, over his lifetime, of what's happened to human rights. Have we seen more respect, less respect? Are we seeing decline now? And then thirdly, we have Joaquin Castro, serving his 6th term in the United States Congress, previously chair of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and so forth, a committee that's now been abolished by the new Republican majority in the House, and Congressman Castro is serving as a ranking member on the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee. He hails from the country that really, whose extraordinary leader, Eleanor Roosevelt, drove the writing of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and it'll be great to hear his view on where that sits in the United States today. So that's the agenda today. Let me ask you, the audience, did any of you bring a burning question this morning that you really hoped would be answered? Yes.
Hi, I'm Kenji from Nikkei. My burning question, since on this member that we have here, on China. I was kind of surprised that you said that you were asking Mr. Türk to start out with the children's rights. That's very important. But at the same time, I thought human rights situation in China, where the economic cloud has been getting bigger and bigger, and that is actually affecting the other countries' decision on whatever voting that's been done or whatever decision-making that be done in terms of China's situation. So if anyone or all of you could comment on how to deal with China's human rights issue, namely like Xinjiang, Tibet, and all sorts of other, and also a lot of journalists are being detained for a long time.
Yeah, great, thank you. Point made. China, I'm putting it on the agenda, and we've got one other question, and then I'd like to come to the panel. Sorry, I just wanted quick fire questions.
I think we know what's in the public domain in terms of human rights. What we don't know, it's what we don't know, as in what you know about human rights and what's not in the public domain, so that we know what causes to fight for. That would be really helpful. Mandeep Rai, author of The Values Compass, BBC. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What's not in the public domain? Well, we'll get to both of those, but I would like to start by inviting Volker Türk to explain to us the sharp decline in respect for children's rights, and I guess to open up a couple of these questions, should this, in your view, be our priority concern at this moment?
Well, first of all, it's great that we have a panel at the WEF on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and you mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt, because Eleanor Roosevelt was actually chairing the commission that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's interesting because we sometimes forget, and it's one of the things that you have mentioned, there is this artificial dichotomy between civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Well, actually, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights certainly did not take that view. It integrated all of these rights and made them universal. And Eleanor Roosevelt, it's really one of her legacies. She was the one fighting very hard that economic, social rights are included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I think sometimes that gets forgotten. I mean, you asked me about children's rights. I don't want to come up with the litany of concerns that we have in the current environment, but I would like to mention just a couple of trends. We have seen a backsliding on issues that affect women and girls. And I have to say, of course, the most extreme example is Afghanistan, but we have also seen it in the global north in a number of countries. And I think it's important that we are careful about not losing the terrain that we have gained on gender equality issues. We've also seen a backsliding on civic space in a number of countries. I mean, there are autocratic tendencies in many countries around the world, and it has obviously an impact on human rights. We have seen, when it comes to children's rights, sometimes a confusion of how we deal with children's rights and how we are not able to ensure that we mainstream them. And that's one in all the actions in the development arena, in so many other areas of concrete work. We have seen, you mentioned journalists. Journalists all around the world, the safety of journalists has become a particular issue, and we had over the last 10 years, I think it was over 1,300 journalists who were killed because they wanted to ensure that we put the spotlight on situations that are particularly harrowing, and the result was that they were not protected. We should also not lose sight, and that's where children come in and future generations. One of the biggest concerns that Generation Z has is actually climate and environment and human rights. And there is a very strong interconnection, because the way we deal with climate change, the environmental degradation, has immediate repercussions on on the exercise of each and every human right. So I think it's important to bear that in mind. And let me just say one thing at the end, because we often see human rights as doom and gloom. Let's not forget, and we have the president of Timor-Leste, that human rights has been an inspiring force, has energized people, has motivated people. Some of the big social transformations that have taken place in today's world are because of human rights. They go into feminism, LGBTI issues of environmental decolonization, anti-apartheid. So let's not forget that human rights are an incredibly positive force for social change and areas that all concern us.
And High Commissioner, in the face of the decline that you've just described across the world, what is the way, what's your strategy for strengthening human rights at this time, including in individual countries, whether it's China or elsewhere? What's the strategy?
So, we will use this anniversary year as an important launching pad, first of all, to galvanize and to go back to some of the basics on the human rights issues. Because we have seen, even on torture, for example, let's not forget 9/11, torture, sacrosanct, was even questioned. So we have to re-own, and I think it's also a dialogue with young people and with future, and with children in particular, make sure that they understand that this human rights framework is there to work for them, to make sure that they understand that this is something that they can embrace and fight for. And I hope that we can actually have a really galvanizing impact on every country around the world to ensure that young people and children really understand their rights. That's one. The other thing is, of course, both its advocacy, and I think the journalists and media play an incredibly important role, because we need to put the spotlight on those forgotten crises. Haiti is one. We sometimes talk about certain situations. We don't talk enough about with other situations that, frankly, have lost the limelight. So we need to make sure that they remain of concern.
And last question, how do you deal with the pointing the finger issue, right? It's more comfortable for all of us to see human rights abuses in other countries.
Right.
The United Nations is trying to bring all governments along. How do you deal with that?
And this is what my mandate says that I was given by the General Assembly. It's very clear about it. My responsibility is to ensure that we report on human rights violations, but at the same time, and that's where the dilemma comes in, that we engage with governments at the diplomatic level, because we are not a non-governmental organization. We are an intergovernmental organization. We have a whole machinery that works for us. So we have to use every possible tool available in order to advance the human rights cause. And that includes public advocacy, it includes putting the spotlight on certain situations, but it also includes negotiations behind the scenes.
Thank you so much. Let me turn to President Ramos Horta, you've been fighting for human rights for decades. What's your take on where we sit here, January 2023? Are you worried that some of the human rights beliefs, foundations, the role of the United Nations that you've relied on in your career is declining, or is that too pessimistic?
Well, let me say, I'm the chair of the steering committee of an initiative called Global Leaders and Nobel Laureates. It was launched by Kailash Satyarthi, Nobel Peace Prize from India, fantastic individual. He does all the work. I'm the chair, but he's the one who does daily, all his life, 30 years, dedicating to free children from child labor, from child slavery. And when we talk about the declining of child rights, well, it doesn't happen because a group of people in a given country decide to downgrade the rights of children. Mm-hmm. It has to do a lot, always much more with economics. Mm-hmm. With COVID, both Kailash and myself, we alerted G20, G7, everybody, and not only me and him, our group, on the impact of COVID on the livelihood of tens of millions of people in South Asia, in Africa, Latin America, and as a consequence, child labor, child slavery increase. So, and the tragedy is that next to nothing was done by the international community, particularly those who can do something, to support economic recovery in impacted countries by COVID, precisely to prevent further declining of children's well-being. For instance, I, together with Muhammad Yunus, Nobel Peace Prize, Gordon Brown, I personally delivered a letter during my state visit to Indonesia in July. I delivered to President Widodo, in his capacity as the host of G20, a letter signed by me. I was the first signatory. Second was Gordon Brown, appealing to G20 to please work on writing off the debt, first of the fragile states, of the LDCs, and of the highly indebted countries. In this, nothing was done by the international community. No writing off the debt for Sri Lanka. Instead, we went on this wasteful debate of the debt trap. That China debt trap. Well, actually, the debt of Sri Lanka was to China was 12%. Some figures show 20%. All the rest was to Western commercial banks, not to actually to China. But the whole debate was on Chinese debt threat, Chinese debt threat. But in the meantime, well, children's rights in Sri Lanka, like in Pakistan, elsewhere, degraded. Anyway, I'm not as fatalistic or pessimistic like many throughout the last 2 years, because I was also, until a few months ago, a year ago, I was chair of the World Movement for Democracy, based in Washington, D.C., funded by the U.S. Congress. And throughout our discussions, I always heard about setbacks of democracy. I was probably the only lonely voice that said a positive note. Well, there are always ups and downs in human rights, in the struggle for democracy. You see in Washington, you see in Brazil, you see in Europe. That's a dynamic process through centuries, and in the end, human rights improve, change, not because of international institutions, but because there are people on the ground fighting, dying for their freedom. Like Myanmar. Well, the people in Myanmar, they are fighting and dying without support from the international community. So eventually they will prevail, like in Russia, the Soviet Union. Eventually, the Russians prevail, against the Soviet Empire, etc., etc. So I take it this way. Just one point on the role of the UN, of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I once, in 2003, when Serge Melo was appointed High Commissioner, we were very good friends, because I worked, before I was lobbying the subcommittee at the subcommission on protection of minorities and against discrimination. I lobbied the group, so I was at the other end, borrowing the accreditation from some NGOs to be able to speak. And at the time, there was more, more access by civil society to speak at the Human Rights Commission. We had up to 15 minutes. Then they began to cut down. Now I understand 3 minutes, some NGO. And so, yeah. But then Sergio was appointed High Commissioner. We had coffee one morning in Geneva, in the Vieilleville, over many renversés, many croissants. He asked my opinion, because I'm supposed to be an expert, because I was on the receiving side of islands, and then I was foreign minister at the time. I told Sergio, listen, Sergio, let me tell you one thing very blunt. The Secretary General of the UN does not command the biggest economy of the world, does not command the 6th or 7th fleet. You even less. Your power is a power of mediation, of discrete intervention. And I'm talking to you as someone who, in the past, I would complain loud that some government was silent. I would tell Sergio, what would be is more important for you? To speak out, denounce everywhere, every time there is some, or to save even a single life, whether in Iran, in Afghanistan, from execution, from torture, through quiet approach. If and when necessary to speak out, go and talk to the Americans, to the Europeans. They're the ones who have the stick. You don't have the stick. The Americans, they have the stick. Let them speak out.
Thank you.
And you then go and talk to the regimes.
Thank you, President Ramos Horta. You've nailed something that this panel needs to address, and I will come to you all at the end for your other comments on this, which is this, and it goes a little bit to your question from Nikkei, which is, what is the most effective strategy? Is it the quiet back scenes mediation, or is it the public denunciation? The public worry when officials say that it's going to be quiet mediation, that it's not really happening, that they're just not bringing human rights into the debate. Those who work in human rights worry that the public denunciation puts people into corners. But I think having a view from each of you on that would be really useful at the end of this panel. But let me now turn to Joaquin Castro, Congressman from the United States. Is the fire of human rights still burning in the United States?
Yes, absolutely. And first, I want to say it's wonderful to be with all of you and thank each of you for your work with respect to human rights around the world. And let us take a second as we look back on 75 years to celebrate the infrastructure for the respect of humanity that the world has built together. There is today less war, less torture, less genocide, less exploitation of children and others. There is more respect for political and civil rights than there was 75 years ago. So I think for all of us, for the United States and our partners around the world, certainly for those attending here, that's something that we can celebrate. That is something that we can be proud of. That is something that we should mark. I do have concerns about the present and the future. I know others on the panel have spoken about some of those concerns. I want to speak to one because our time is short. And what I see in my role in the United States, China as a nation, and its own companies and entrepreneurs, are on the cutting edge of technology. Technology today has an incredible impact on respect or disrespect for human rights, and will have a growing impact on human rights in the future. Technology can be both beneficial to respecting human rights and also detrimental. If you think about it, there has been a fundamental change in how all of us relate to ourselves, to each other, and to the world over the past 15 to 20 years or so. And again, it is in large part due to some of the companies that are present at this conference. All of us today, I'm sure, are carrying a cell phone. We are all, within 5 seconds of pulling out that cell phone, social documentarians of the world around us. So there is an instant ability for many people, if not most people around the world, to immediately document what they're seeing around them. There is also an incredible ability to distribute that widely so that other people can see it as well. That did not exist, obviously, 75 years ago. It didn't exist 20 years ago. So what it presents for the world is an opportunity to hold leaders accountable, to hold nations accountable in a way that we have not experienced in human history. So the reports of torture, of abuse, of incidents that we see around the world where you have a complete disrespect for human rights, things that we would have read in reports 10 years after they happened, we can now know as a world instantaneously. That is incredibly powerful. And we have to do everything we can to harness the ability of technology to hold leaders and nations and legislative bodies and institutions accountable. But there is also a kind of post-reality, real quick, to all of this, which is that technology can also be used for control, for authoritarianism, for surveillance, for disrespect of privacy, and those challenges with artificial intelligence, quantum computing, some of the other advances in technology are also growing very rapidly, and we have to be mindful of that.
Mm-hmm. And how best to hold governments to account, in your view? You're in your 6th term in Congress. Has your view changed on that?
I'm sorry?
Has your view changed over your 6 terms in Congress? How best to hold other governments to account, or your own government or state governments to account? Is it the public denunciation? Is it the quiet diplomacy, or some combination?
President, you get to a very fundamental, I think among leaders, a very fundamental decision that one has to make in assessing one's leverage over a situation, and whether it is best to speak out very publicly and denounce, which at that time alienates the people in some way that you're speaking to, or whether it's best to try to quietly mediate. I think that it isn't just one person. And so I think the answer is that it is an ensemble effort by people around the world and nations around the world. I think, quite honestly, it's the role of some people to be very vocal and to speak out. But it's also the role of others, as the President mentioned, to step in behind the scenes and say, hey, you know, how can we work this out? What can be done? So I don't know that there's a single answer. It depends on the institution. It depends on the leverage that they have over the situation, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm. Last word to the High Commissioner on this.
Well, you know,
do you need people fighting on the ground and yelling and denouncing so that you can go and mediate?
You do. But I don't believe in a binary view of the world. I think we need all tools available to us in order to advance the human rights cause. And it includes presence on the ground, it includes operational engagement, it includes concrete actions to actually make a difference in people's lives. It includes speaking out publicly. It includes quiet diplomatic negotiations behind the scenes. So I think we need all tools at our disposal.
Thank you so much. With 30 seconds to go, is there a question from the audience that, yeah.
It's great to see this panel today, and thank you for your comments. My question is whether you think human rights is being addressed adequately in the Davos agenda generally for the next few days. And if not, what should be on the agenda for next year to really ensure that human rights is not just one event, but is much more mainstreamed in the discussions by banks, investors, and companies?
2 words from each of you, starting with Joaquin.
Sure. Listen, I think there could always be more. And quite honestly, I haven't looked at the full roster of programs and sessions, but I think it's absolutely important because of, particularly here, because of the interface of the companies that are on the cutting edge of that technology that I mentioned, and the need to respect human rights. It should be discussed as much as possible here.
Great. High Commissioner?
Look, for the future of business, human rights has to be part and parcel of it. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So the more we can discuss it, including with the private sector, the better it is.
State Secretary?
Well, I couldn't agree more on what has just been said. I think human rights is a cross-cutting issue, is very important, and has more and more also reached the private sector. So companies are also aware there is more readiness to talk about human rights. So I think this is certainly a good place to address it.
And let me turn to our President and Nobel Prize winner. Last word.
Sometimes sanctions applied on the situation of human rights violations, rather than improving the situation, further isolate the people on the ground, students, academics, local businesses, leaving them entirely to the mercy of those in power. I have dealt with Myanmar for at least 30 years, and out of personal interest. Back then, in the 2000 plus, I received in my own country a French businessman. He was in Myanmar, and he told me, within the confines of my factory, I protect the people, I pay them well. Outside the factory, I have no power. And if I'm told to close down because of human rights violation in Myanmar, all this, the factory is sold, probably the military will be happy to buy it, and they lose everything. I talked with an author, a writer. She's American, but grew up in UK, and her nickname is, real name anyway, Sarah Rooney, a very smart young lady. And she's an academic writer. And she said in Myanmar back then, now obviously worse, academic students were complaining about the sanctions, cutting them off from the rest of the world. So how you balance between, that's very difficult situation. And the last, I would say, people on the ground, us in the past, anywhere, are fighting for human rights, for freedom, regardless of whether the international community, the UN, support or does not support. This is what's happening in Myanmar today and in so many other countries. In the end, human rights, democracy prevails. A beautiful story about how the world changes. I was in Geneva in the early 80s. Driving one day to Geneva from Lyon, I heard BBC News. 8 a.m. sharp. It talked about a Soviet cosmonaut who had gone into space, and when he was returning home, he was told from Moscow, do not come back, your country no longer exists. Soviet Union had ceased to exist. Well, the mightiest empire, military empire, surrender without being able to fire a shot. And no one used weapons in Soviet Union to fight the communist dictatorship. It was Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov and all of these people, and of course supporters around the world who, it will happen. And,
Thank you so much, President. We're out of time on this 75th year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You've heard a lot about how human rights, even though we're seeing egregious abuses of human rights around the world, can nevertheless be upheld, particularly, in the words of the President, by those fighting on the ground to uphold their human rights and by our efforts to support them, which aren't always in sanctions and public denunciation, which is the easiest, in a way, thing to do sitting in other countries. We've heard about technology, we've heard about mediation, we've heard about the Swiss government's commitment to human rights. Can you join me in thanking this fantastic panel for the briefing this morning?
Audience, I read my telling our mission in New York never to schedule me to be the first speaker in the morning in the General Assembly, never the